this project started because I found myself really frustrated with the way the narrative of the US empire is taught as a story of expansion, primarily because, expansion communicates a type of common sense inevitability. And within this narrative, the US conquest of in the West, the occupation of Hawaii, and the accompanying militarized nature of everyday life in the islands are framed as events that were always meant to be. In other words, Hawaii is understood and imagined in this narrative only in relation to the United States as a territory and state already and always in the making. And as I began my research journey in graduate school, I found that this 5-year period between the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893 by the American-backed Haole, which means foreign and white oligarchy, and annexation to the United States in 1898 was often framed as an inevitable step of this American expansion, and that much of the historical analysis, aside from the work of Kanaka Maoli or Hawaiian scholars and practitioners like Noinoi Silva or Jonathan Osorio, works which I couldn't have done or created my book without, ignored these years where so much was at stake. And in essence, this historiographical erasure then served to further naturalize the narrative of American expansion in the Pacific. And this way of thinking and narrating empire in Oceania, in the Pacific, is what my book challenges. So I'm really trying to tell another story to rupture this narrative of inevitability by considering what could have been, and by doing so, hopefully imagining and envisioning what still could be. So framed most broadly, the question my book tackles is, what does the history of empire and occupation in the Pacific Island world look like when told from an island-centered perspective? Or in other words, how does an island-centered methodology open up different ways of seeing and understanding oceanic connectivities and circulations of power across a Pacific Island world? And here, I'm building off of the work by scholars like Epele Haofa and using the term island-centered perspective as more than just location, right? It's about understanding a Pacific Islander world as ripe with the confluence and constituencies of power, agency, domination, and diversion. And what I hope to have demonstrated through my book is that an island-centered methodology makes it possible to consider how the intersections between trans-Pacific imperial formations and local politics of jurisdiction revealed the nation state to be a category of contingent and contentious practice, and that writing from the islands also creates space to consider the centrality of indigenous articulations of sovereignty to competing imperial projects. So, when compared to the coup, right, the case of an escaped Japanese prisoner, the failed 1895 Kanaka Maoli-led counter-revolution, and the indemnity case of a Portuguese carriage driver. These are a few examples from the book that I read as historical flashpoints. They at first may appear to be non-events in the narration of a state-based history, but I argue that reading these moments from an island-centered perspective reveals their connections to global repercussions, emphasizes the relevance of Hawaii's political plurality in the making of a modern geopolitical order in the Pacific, and brings the realities of Hawaii's simultaneous colonial, inter-imperial, and sovereign existence into the same frame. Or in other words, each historical flashpoint then highlights how seemingly quotidian moments of localized refusal led to larger political repercussions and international meaning. And this leads me to the idea of confluence. And confluence was a key organizing theme, of course, it's also in the title, that I used to think through the numerous intersections that I follow in the book. And I deploy the term in order to simultaneously accentuate the plurality of social relations that those living in Hawaii were embedded within at the time, while also leaving room to highlight specific state reactions. And one of the key methodological arguments that the book makes is that this ability to see multiple intersecting strands, to examine this confluence between local and global, indigenous and external, marginalized and elite, is only possible when one looks out from an island-centered and island-based point of view. And because this is all pretty, abstract and broad, I'd like to end by focusing on one moment, one vignette that concretizes the stakes of this project. And this vignette that I'm going to share today is what got me hooked on this project. And it's a story about an Issei immigrant in contract labor named Yosaku Imada. This is the first chapter of the book. And in 1889, 26-year-old Imada was assigned to work on a sugar plantation in Waihe'e, Maui. While he's there, he gets married. In early April 1892, he returns home from his work in the sugarcane fields, and he finds his wife in bed with a fellow Issei named Kanazawa, and proceeds to attack Kanazawa with a hatchet, and this results in Kanazawa's death. And although Imada claims he was innocent, he ends up being convicted and found guilty of second-degree murder under the Hawaiian Kingdom's judicial system and sent to Oahu prison in September 1892. Now, a few months later, in March 1893, Imada is, on work detail on Kamoku Akulikuli, or Oahu's reef-based quarantine island. And as he's, toiling under the observation of guards, he notices the Naniwa, it's a Japanese warship anchored offshore, and he decides to attempt an escape. So he jumps into the ocean, swims to the ship, where he's quickly taken on board. And although Imada has no intention of creating a diplomatic crisis, his escape makes global headlines. So after reading the story, my question was why, right? Why was this making international headlines? And why would both the Meiji and US governments get involved in deciding the fate of this one contract laborer in Hawaii? Well, had the Naniwa been a merchant ship, it would have been subject to the provisional government's authority. But as a vessel of war, it carried its national sovereignty on board. So in essence, as the newspapers at the time described, it's like a piece of Japan docked in Honolulu Harbor. So although Imada was convicted under the Hawaiian Kingdom's judicial system, by the time he swam for his freedom in March 1893, the monarchy had been overthrown and the 2-month-old provisional government had yet to forge an extradition treaty with Japan. So Imada's escape then presented the provisional government with one of its first diplomatic entanglements. And the debate over his release underscores questions about who held power in the politically ambiguous archipelago at the time. So his act of seeking refuge on board a Japanese warship docked in Honolulu Harbor ultimately forces the developing Meiji and US empires to grapple with issues of race-based citizenship and state-based jurisdiction as questions concerning the extraterritorial reach of each of these developing empires push political leaders in both countries to contemplate who could claim state protection, and in this specific case, who held jurisdiction over Imada's body. So this contract workers headline-making getaway is just one example of how actions taken by everyday people could challenge seemingly stable categories as nation, state, and citizenship by bringing the global into the realm of local events and individual aspirations. And this is one of the narrative threads that I use throughout the book. And while Imada was undoubtedly focused on his freedom, his escape ultimately positions Hawaii between developing empires searching for ways to delineate themselves within the rapidly changing context of global and national space at the end of the 19th century, and help to bring the future political configuration of Hawaii and the Pacific Island world into question. And this is something I argue in the book that becomes clear when one proceeds from this island-centered perspective.